Welcome to Regis World Literature. This is Lesson 19, the second topic on Lesson 19, which is grammar. And today we're going to talk about periods. Now, at first blush, periods would seem very simple to us. And mostly this topic will be very simple. And there won't be much that will surprise you. But there will be a couple of ideas here that I want to make sure you have down. Okay, so when we have a sentence and we don't have an exclamation point or a question mark, we will have a period. Every sentence must close with some form of punctuation. Most often, it will be the period. You're very familiar with this from elementary school. We could write a declarative sentence. For instance, I run 3 miles every morning. That would end with a period. We could write a imperative sentence giving a command like please start the car. That would end with a period. We could write a conditional sentence like I could study better if you turn down the music. And that is a form of declarative, or we could distinguish it by calling it a conditional sentence in some grammars. And that also ends with a period. Now, when I want to express great emotion of either joy or something else, maybe surprise or fear, I would use an exclamation point. And that is totally at the prerogative of the writer, provided that you do not use it too frequently. If you use a exclamation point every couple of pages or every page or two, unless you are in some fantastically emotive dialogue, it would get trite, and people would tend to devalue your exclamations. But what I'm saying is I would recommend that you use exclamation points cautiously or sparingly. We'll talk more about that when we get to that topic. Okay, so if you're writing a question, an interrogative sentence, you always need a question mark. For instance, did you sleep well? Question mark, not period. Those things I would expect to be obvious to you. Probably the first thing that I think is significant is what do you do when you use a period with quotation marks? I'm going to read the directions. We're taking this as our definitive punctuation book, okay, on rules. If a sentence uses quotation marks to indicate something that another person has said, and the quotation marks appear at the end of the sentence, the period can appear in one of two places. But in American English, which is the one we're going to use, the punctuation used at the end of direct speech always appears within the quotation marks. For example, the sentence says, the CEO said, and then we're quoting his words directly. We call this a direct quote. Okay. This is a great day for the company. Now notice what we have here, which is very, very important because not all of you do this right in your papers. When we say and we're going to get ready to say something directly, the CEO said. By the way, I want you could use another word like for that. Okay, it doesn't matter. Or stated, the CEO stated. Or when you're quoting, you say the scripture said, or the scripture instructs. When you're getting ready to quote directly, you don't want to just say the scripture without a verb. You must have a verb here, something equivalent to or synonymous with said. Then you must have a comma, and you must have a quote. So these three are very important. Comma, quote, then whatever he's saying that I'm quoting, then period, quote. The quote is outside the ending period. Okay. Now, some of you note that, but I do want to make another example. The question is, how many spaces do you use when you have sentence 1, which is going to end with a period, and then sentence 2 that begins with a new capital letter? How many spaces? And the answer is 1. Okay. Now, it used to be when Mr. Kinzer and I were in school, we were taught to use 2 spaces. Why? Because we did not have computers. Okay. We had manual typewriters when we started. And manual typewriters, the space between after a period was truncated. And so they wanted to make it very clear to the eye that a new sentence was beginning. So we were taught to use 2 spaces here. But today, all modern grammars agree that the correct answer now is 1 space between sentences. Now, the next topic we want to move on to is abbreviations. And here again is some place an area where British grammar and American grammar disagree or use different rules. So a rule that you're probably very familiar with is that we do want to use a period at the end of every abbreviation. So here we have Dr., Mr., Mrs., Friday, Avenue. When in doubt, don't use an abbreviation in formal writing. In other words, I would not tend to use this one in formal writing. I would write it out. Okay. But it gets a little stickier, and I want to make sure you understand the whole set of rules. So let me give you an example that might surprise you a little bit. Okay, so in this example, my new house is on Lilac Avenue, just across from the old courthouse. What we have is Avenue, our abbreviation, and we're going to put a period there because it's an abbreviation, but we need the comma for the rest of the sentence. And so you will sometimes see a period comma like this. Now let me give you another example. That would not surprise me so much, but the next one is probably even more rare. I think this is unusual. I can't say that I've seen this many times. It says, are you returning to work in February? And notice we have February abbreviated. So we need that period. And then it's at the end of the sentence. And so I would put my ending punctuation, which is not a period, a question mark, afterwards. So to see a period and then a question mark, I would say is pretty unusual. If it were me, I would tend to sidestep this scenario by writing it out. Okay. So when in doubt, write it out. Don't use an abbreviation. Now you would never, however, see 2 periods together. So if I said, classes resume in February, and I just want to put the abbreviation Feb, I would put 1 period, and even if it's at the end of the sentence, I would not use 2 periods in a row. Never 2 periods in a row. Now the next topic is going to be when we use initials with names like C.S. Lewis or J.R.R. Tolkien, or with acronyms like AWOL, he's going AWOL, absent without leave in the military, or ASAP, capitalized or not, as soon as possible, okay, or what we call initialisms, where we always notice AWOL, I tend to say it as one word now, or ASAP, I might say as one word, and we call that technically an acronym and initialism, where we tend to actually pronounce them as letters, like ATM machine. But sometimes those blur. Like I say ASAP, and many other people say ASAP. Or I say UFO, and many people say UFO. Now, what are the rules? And the bottom line is the rules for all those kinds of things, both initials with names, acronyms, and initialisms, are variable. They're losing a strict rule through use, which oftentimes happens in grammar. Grammar shifts over the decades. And so, because they're variable, the key is consistency. In your writing, never go from form to form in the same paper. Okay. So there's 3 different kinds of rules. As long as you're consistent with each of them, you'll be all right. Okay, so the last 3 groups here, as I've just already explained, whether they're initials and names, acronyms, or initialisms, and I don't care that you really understand the distinction between these two. It has to do with pronunciation, but again, even our pronunciation blurs across them. The key idea, however, is that you choose. Either use periods or don't use periods, but be consistent across the paper or across the work. In other words, if I choose to say C.S. Lewis with periods one time in the paper, do it all the time in the paper. It doesn't mean that if I use periods in C.S. Lewis, I must write periods with if I'm talking about a UFO or a UFO. Okay. It doesn't mean you have to be consistent across these 3, but you must be consistent within each category. Okay. So, periods are most summarize here. Periods are most commonly used to mark the end of sentences. In American English, the period is placed within the quotation marks at the end of a sentence. After a period, before the beginning of a new sentence, you use 1 space, and though he tells us what's often most preferential, there's enough variety. My rule is going to be initialisms, acronyms, or initials of names. You go ahead and pick your preference in style and stick to it. Okay. However, strict abbreviations where letters are omitted, as we talked about with Doctor and Avenue, always use a period. And that's the end of these rules. Go ahead and make sure you understand these and master these each week. We'll be starting to go through them more quickly as we move along.